Good morning, everybody. I wanted to give you guys some helpful hints on how to do the Gear Lab and how to use this gear generator web program. So first thing, if you look at the first question, it says clear all of the gears on your screen. So you can either hit this clear button or you can come here and click on the first gear and hit remove, and it will remove all of the gears before this gear. So if we hit remove, it says, are you sure you want to remove all of the child gears as well? That's all the gears that are attached to it, and you want to hit yes. So we now only have one gear on our screen. So we've done the first part of the instructions for one. Now we need to learn how to resize this gear. And the way we're going to change the size of this gear is by changing the number of teeth. And that's this option right here. The smallest you can go is 4 teeth, because you still have to have enough teeth to connect to another gear. And the largest you can go is 400. So you can see here that it's kind of disappeared off my screen. The best thing to do here is actually to zoom out. So if you come down here and hit scale underneath display, you might have to scroll down on your Chromebooks and hit zoom out. You can only zoom out this much. So 400 tooth gear is pretty big, and we can see by looking at it that it is quite large. And we can't actually fit the whole thing on the screen. So you might want to use a smaller gear. I know on my screen, I can get, I think, a 200 tooth gear where you can see most of it. So that's how you change the size. What I want you to do for step one is to watch the little dot on the wheel. So let me make this, or on the gear, let me make this smaller so we can see the dot a little better. I'll zoom in again. This is the dot that I'm talking about. So you want to look at this dot and say, okay, how fast is this going? And then change the size. So maybe we go to 100 tooth gear. And then we might have to zoom out to see the dot. But you look at the dot, and does the dot look like it's going faster? If you're having trouble answering this question, maybe pretend like you're standing next to the gear. And would you see this dot go past you faster or slower? Okay, so answer that question. Make sure you answer it in a complete sentence so that I know if you're saying that it's faster when it's bigger or faster when it's slower. Now, if we go on to number 2, what we're doing is we're counting the number of seconds it takes for this dot to make it around the whole gear. One thing I would suggest doing is maybe start at the top and put your mouse right there and start counting now when it goes right past your cursor. This does not have to be super precise. I am completely fine if you go, say, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi, 5 Mississippi, 6 Mississippi, 7 Mississippi, 8 Mississippi, 9 Mississippi, 10 Mississippi. Just as long as you do the same thing for both the large gear and the small gear when you count it. Okay? Now, when we get to number 3 that has the chart underneath it, we need more than one gear. Okay? So to add another gear, you should click Add New. And you'll see that this next gear popped up right down here. When you are filling in the table for number 3, I highly recommend that you do not change the RPM for gear number 1. Okay? So gear number 1 acts like it's connected to a motor. And you change the speed of the motor with this option right here. So if we make it 60 instead of 6, you can see that the gear goes much faster now. So I'm going to put it back to 6. For the table, I highly recommend that you leave your RPM for gear 1 at 6. Just leave it the same. I guess if you've already changed it, it doesn't matter. Just leave it the same for the whole table. We want to see how changing the number of teeth on both of these gears affects the RPM you get out here. So, a few things that I want to point out. To select the different gears, you can select them this way, or you can click on them over here. If you click on them over here, it doesn't always work. So if you're having trouble selecting it, just come over here and select it up here. The next thing I want to mention is on your table, I have it labeled as gear 1 and gear 2. This has it labeled as gear number 0. So gear number 0 is gear number 1 on your table. Now, for the values that you fill in on your table, N is going to tell you your number of teeth. So this is 100 teeth. And if we look down here where it says number of teeth, it says 100. And then if we look at this one, it says N13. That means you have 13 teeth on what would be gear 2 on your table. Where you read the RPM is over here where it says RPM. So you have RPM of 6, and here you have an RPM of 46.15. So those would be the values you would fill on your table. So maybe for your first row, teeth on gear 1 would be 100, RPM on gear 1 would be 6, teeth on gear 2 would be 13, and the RPM would be 46.15. Okay? I would highly recommend only changing one thing for each column. So maybe change the number of teeth on gear 1 and then record how that changed things. Then change the number of teeth on gear 2 and see how that changed things. And then fill in your table that way. Once you get to 4 and 5, I give you a specific number of teeth. And so put those in and then tell me what RPM each of them is going. And then on number 6, I want you to think about what you've seen. See how your speed or your RPM increases if you change the number of size or your size of your gears. If you can, see if you can find a mathematical relationship. Now, once we get to number 7, you'll see that we need 3 gears instead of 2. And I want to point out a possible problem you might have here. If you have selected gear number 0, what we had called gear number 1 on our table, and you hit add new, you'll see that it doesn't really look like anything's happened. And the reason for that is we've added a second gear that's connected to this first gear, which is not what we want. So what we want to do is we want to remove this gear, and you need to select your second gear and then hit add new to get that third gear at the end of the chain. Everything else works the same here. You can change the size of each individual gear. You can type it in here or use the plus or minus buttons and see how everything works. For the last one, I did want to mention you cannot start with an RPM of 24. So this first gear cannot have an RPM of 24. I would recommend leaving it 6 because that will make it work pretty well. If you have any questions, please contact me. Email is probably the best way to do that. And good luck. Have fun with the Gear Lab.